The Great Warming, Climate Change and the Rise and Fall of Civilizations. Written by Brian Fagan. Narrated by Tavia Gilbert. Chapter 7. Acorns and Pueblos. If the drought withered the corn shoots, if the buffalo unaccountably shifted, or if the salmon failed to run, the very existence of people in other regions was shaken to its foundations. But the manifold distribution of available foods in California and the working out of corresponding means of reclaiming them prevented a failure of the acorn crop from producing similar effects. It might produce short rations and racking hunger, but scarcely starvation. Alfred Kroeber, Handbook of the Indians of California, 1925. The channel is glassy smooth. The ridges of the snow-capped mountains razor clear against the sharp blue sky of the winter day. The crews paddle in the lightest of southeasterly airs, relishing the calm after the strong northwesterlies of the day before that had followed the rain and snow of a strong winter storm. The ocean slowly turns a gorgeous roseate pink with the westering sun, a color that lingers long after sunset. Basking sharks move lazily close to the surface, their fins and tails moving imperceptibly in the calm. The weathered, planked canoes glide swiftly over the mirror-like water, taking advantage of the calm instead of the very high waves of the Pacific Sea, which at times seem to lift them as far as the clouds and at other times to bury them in the bottom of the sea. The paddlers crouch on seagrass pads, paddling steadily, hour after hour, chanting the same canoe song over and over again, as a boy, huddled in the bottom of the boat, bails with an abalone shell. The echoes of the canoe chant float on the still air as the afterglow of sunset fades and the men come close to land. The great droughts of the warm centuries in the American West tested ancient strategies of movement to the limit. People died. There was certainly hunger. In some areas, such as Southern California, there were startling changes in the nature of society itself, which became more hierarchical, even more despotic. But through it all, the inhabitants of the West quietly survived. Their traditional lifeways would have continued indefinitely had not European explorers, then missionaries and settlers, introduced new, totally unfamiliar factors into cultural equations that had thrived for centuries, even millennia. By no means all Western societies lived in desert landscapes. As one moved west toward the Pacific, the varied terrain of what is now California supported some of the most diverse environments on Earth. Small mountain valleys, local wetlands, and lush valleys with shallow lakes. In some areas, San Francisco Bay and the Santa Barbara Channel, for instance, rich maritime fisheries, shellfish beds, and sea mammal rookeries provided so much food that many groups could remain in one place for most of the year, if not all. Away from the ocean or permanent rivers and lakes, people relied heavily on wild plants, on widely scattered foods that came into season at different times of the year. Every forager, young or old, male or female, had an encyclopedic knowledge of edible environments, but people were constrained to move constantly to exploit them. This mobility reduced some of their vulnerability to drought cycles, but with the notable exception of the drought-susceptible pinyon, few plant foods could be stored for any length of time. Bands living in some parts of the Great Basin and over much of California came to rely on a surprisingly nutritious staple, the carbohydrate-rich acorn. Acorns came into use wherever oaks grew in California after about 2000 BC, at first as a supplemental food. This was a time when the climate was cooler and wetter than today, and California's population was rising steadily. Both grass seeds and other long-utilized plants became scarcer as a result. We know there was hunger because human skeletons dating to earlier than 1000 BC, before acorns came into widespread use, display many more signs of malnutrition, such as Harris lines that appear in limb bones as a result of temporary retardation of growth, and dental hyperplasia, layers of defective tooth enamel in children, then later burials. The changeover to intensive acorn consumption may well have resulted from overcrowding, more frequent food shortages, and malnutrition episodes. Interestingly, once acorns became a staple, the incidence of dental caries increased dramatically, owing to a carbohydrate-rich diet. Once the changeover took place, each band readily accepted the extra labor involved in processing and storing acorns, which provided much more abundant and nutritious food. The staple could be stored in quantities so large that many harvesters collected a full year's supply in a few weeks. The only other solution to recurring hunger would have been to start growing maize and beans, just as people were doing in the Southwest. The acorn foragers were well aware of agriculture, but why take the trouble of clearing fields and growing crops when acorns are ready to hand? By the time of Christ, the acorn was a staple of California life, from Oregon to the southern deserts. The acorn did not revolutionize life in the California of 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. This humble nut merely made food supplies more predictable for people living in a more crowded and territorially circumscribed world. But during the prolonged droughts of the medieval warm period, heavy dependence on acorns increased the risk of famine, for the acorn harvest was seriously affected by dry conditions. A.D. 1100. A grove of California oaks on a hot fall day. The bright sunlight casts fretted shadows on the ground during the hectic weeks of the ancient acorn harvest. The band has carried stacks of empty baskets to the trees early in the day. While the older men hunt for deer that feed on the rich mast from the oak groves, young boys leap into the branches and shake the boughs gently. Ripe acorns shower the women and elders. They laugh as they gather the plump nuts into baskets, combing the ground carefully, quickly discarding cracked or rotten nuts, keeping only those that will store well. As the youths climb more trees, the women carry the full baskets back to camp, where they dump the acorns on dry hides. The harvest continues from dawn until dark, for there are only a few days in the year when the acorns are easily harvested. Early Californians were by no means the first people in history to rely on acorns. Entire villages in Syria subsisted off acorns 14,000 years ago. Medieval European farmers consumed bushels of acorns. So did Native Americans in the Midwest. As late as the 19th century, acorns provided about 20% of the rural diet in Italy and Spain. But acorns were nowhere so important as they were in California, with its highly varied environment and endemic droughts. They have excellent nutritional value and are also highly tolerant of storage. Under favorable circumstances, they will keep for up to 2 years in large baskets or specially built granaries, a priceless quality for people who lived in unpredictable environments. By A.D. 500, thousands of California Indians depended heavily on the immense acorn harvest. At Spanish contact in the 16th century, native Californians harvested more than 66,000 tons or 60,000 metric tons of acorns a year, more than the industrialized sweet corn crop in the state today. For many groups, acorns constituted over half the diet. The ancient precaution of a broadly based diet had yielded in the face of abundance. We know a great deal about acorn consumption, thanks to finds of acorn fragments in numerous archaeological sites, also the grinders and pounders used to process them. Fortunately, too, we have an archive of information about the harvesting, processing, and storage of acorns from both observations of traditional societies and modern-day consumption practices. Balanophagy, acorn eating, flourishes, for many people swear by tasty acorn bread. As a result, we have a great deal of information on this all-important ancient and modern food. 15 species of oaks grow from Oregon to California. In good years, California oaks could yield as many as 1,728 pounds per 2.5 acres, or 784 kilograms per hectare, a yield rivaling that of medieval agriculture in Europe and sufficient to support 50 to 60 times more people than lived in California when the Spanish arrived. Unfortunately, however, the harvest fluctuated from grove to grove, even from tree to tree, and most oak species produced a good crop only every 2 or 3 years. The ancient foragers, well aware of this, responded by harvesting acorns from different areas. The long storage life of acorns helped compensate for irregular harvests, but acorns have other serious disadvantages. They are a labor-intensive crop, not so much to harvest as to process. Shelling and pounding them is just the beginning, for because of the bitter-tasting tannic acid they contain, they are inedible unless soaked in water. Processing acorns took far longer than grinding seeds. By one estimate, about 4 hours to produce 2.4 pounds, about 1 kilogram of meal from 5.9 pounds, or 2.7 kilograms of pounded acorns. But the effort was well worth it, for the nuts or processed flour could be carried on long journeys or in canoes, as well as used to make nourishing breads and gruels. By the time the medieval warm period began, around AD 900, most forager groups spent more and more of their time in permanent base camps within narrow compasses of territory, in many cases traveling no more than some 5 miles or 8 kilometers from their homes during their entire lives. The small sizes of tribal territories also made each group dependent on others. When droughts reduced the productivity of the environment, kin ties with other groups became very important as a way of acquiring food. Each group had control over local food supplies, such as, for example, acorn groves, fishing pools, or reliable stands of edible seeds. These they exploited more intensively than they would for their own needs, passing food to widely separated communities as part of a complex web of interconnectedness that linked dozens of small villages and the individuals who presided over them. One could not survive in California's highly localized and varied environments without the help of others. The range of artifacts and commodities exchanged between communities takes one's breath away. All kinds of foodstuffs, from acorns and game meat to mollusk flesh, as well as other essentials such as salt and medicinal plants. Asphaltum, for waterproofing baskets, changed hands, as did basket-making materials and bow wood. Obsidian, a volcanic glass, was highly prized and found at only a few locations, for example Medicine Lake Highlands in Northern California. Fortunately, obsidian from different locations has distinctive trace elements that can be identified by spectrographic analysis, so we know that obsidian from Medicine Lake traveled over 50 miles or 80 kilometers from its source. Millions of abalone and olivella seashell beads circulated through California during the warm centuries, as populations rose and territories became smaller. The ancient Mojave Trail carried Pacific shell beads as far as agricultural communities in the Southwest. Other bead strings passed from hand to hand deep into the Great Basin. But most trade was purely local, between people who depended on one another for essential commodities in increasingly circumscribed environments. The prolonged droughts of the medieval warm period played havoc with long-established trading arrangements. Live oaks are susceptible to drought, which reduced acorn harvests considerably over and above the normal interannual fluctuations. We know little about the effects of long-term drought on these trees, which are well adapted to long dry seasons, but seasonal aridity and multi-year dry cycles are different matters. For instance, between 1986 and 1992, a 6-year drought killed thousands of oak trees in coastal central California, especially those growing on south-facing slopes, which tend to be drier and with less fertile soils. About 10% of all oaks, regardless of species, had perished by 1992. Had not 1993 and later years been wetter, the mortality would have increased dramatically, well above the normal casualty rates from fires, insects, and other causes. Project the 10% figure back 1,000 years and factor in prolonged, repeated droughts, and the effects on acorn harvests must have been brutal. Unfortunately, archaeology is an anonymous record of history, so the voices of those who lived through the dry centuries are silent. Only a few shreds of evidence come down to us, including some skeletons from 2 Yokutt Indian cemeteries from the San Joaquin Valley discovered during the construction of the Interstate 5 freeway. The burial places bracket the medieval droughts and were used by people who relied heavily on acorns. Using computer tomography, the biological anthropologist Elizabeth Weiss measured the cortical thickness of femurs, a cumulative dimension that reflects changes in diet and nutrition over a person's lifetime. She found that the individuals buried in the earlier cemetery, which dated to about 2,000 years ago, had thicker cortical bone and fewer pathologies or traumatic injuries than those from the burial ground dating to between 1,100 and 1,200 years ago, the time of prolonged drought. These people had thinner cortical bone, lived shorter lives, and manifested many more injuries, as well as showing evidence of malnutrition. Acorns were certainly inadequate protection against prolonged drought for people who relied on little else for their diet, but we need another generation of research to fill in the details. The situation was somewhat different in areas around San Francisco Bay and in the Santa Barbara Channel region, where rich marine environments allowed people to settle in the same place for long periods of time. In the case of the Santa Barbara Channel, natural upwelling close inshore provided rich anchovy harvests, except in occasional El Niño years, when rising sea surface temperatures affected marine productivity. But even in these favored areas, life was uncertain, especially when drought affected drinking water supplies. The Santa Barbara Channel, south of Point Conception, is another climatic Rosetta Stone, site of an exquisitely precise 656-foot or 200-meter deep-sea core that extends 160,000 years into the past. The uppermost 56 feet or 17 meters represent the past 11,000 years, and rapid sedimentation rates on the sea floor provide fine-grained climatic information. We actually have a record of temperature change at 82-foot or 25-meter intervals over the past 3 millennia. The core abounds in 2 species of planktonic foraminifera, one that dwelled close to the surface, the other inhabiting a depth of about 197 feet, or 60 meters. By analyzing the oxygen isotope content of these organisms and radiocarbon dating 20 samples of the tiny shells, the oceanographer James Kennett has been able to reconstruct cycles of changing sea surface temperatures within a regimen that was generally reasonably warm, around 54.5 degrees Fahrenheit or 12.5 degrees Celsius on average. From the Kennett temperature curve, we learn that there were warmer sea temperatures between about 2,900 and 1,500 years ago, with a colder cycle following between 1,500 and 500 years before the present, after which the temperature warms until modern times. The coldest sea surface temperatures since the Ice Age fell between 1,500 and 500 years ago, centuries that included the medieval warm period. Marine productivity in the Santa Barbara Channel rose and fell with cold and warm intervals. During cool periods, the foraminifera show that there was only a slight temperature gradient between 197 feet, or 60 meters, and the surface, as if the natural upwelling in the channel was very strong and there was constant vertical mixing of seawater. This process was especially intense between 1,000 and 500 years ago. Upwelling and marine productivity were dramatically reduced during the warmer cycle between 2,900 and 1,500 years ago. Furthermore, ocean temperatures displayed marked instability between 1,500 and 800 years ago. The climatic shifts in the Santa Barbara Channel are matched by those recorded on land. Especially low sea surface temperatures appear to coincide with the prolonged drought cycles over much of western North America, especially with those recorded from bristlecone pine tree rings in the White Mountains of eastern California. The Santa Barbara Channel was home to many Chumash Indian groups, whose ancestry goes back deep into the remote past. When the first European explorers anchored off this coast in the 16th century, they reported large villages and dense populations both on the Channel Islands close offshore and on the mainland. For many centuries, we know, the coastal population remained relatively sparse. Then, after about 3,000 years ago, trading activity between neighboring communities and between the coast, the offshore islands, and the interior picked up rapidly. Judging from the number of archaeological sites on the Pacific coast, the population increased as fishing intensified. Population densities increased even more after about 1,300 years ago, as maritime productivity increased with active upwelling. The changes are particularly noticeable on the Channel Islands, where food resources were patchy, but shellfish and inshore fisheries abounded. After about AD 450, sea temperatures cooled for some 10 centuries, resulting in strong upwelling and an abundance of fish of all kinds. This was a period when coastal populations exploded, and permanent settlements along the Pacific became more commonplace. On the Channel Islands, the major settlements developed more or less equidistant from one another, as if they had distinct, well-marked fishing and foraging territories. Many of these settlements continued in use into historic times, so their inhabitants appear in mission records and in oral traditions, recorded in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We know this because on November 20, 1884, Juan Estevan Pico, a Chumash speaker who lived in the San Buenaventura Indian community at the southern end of the Santa Barbara Channel, compiled a list of no fewer than 21 island villages. The names of at least 11 chiefs appear in baptismal records, most of which date to between 1814 and 1822. The rapid depopulation of the islands resulted from the effects of European diseases, the collapse of cross-channel trading, and an extended drought. On Santa Cruz Island, the largest of the archipelago, most of the larger settlements lay in sheltered bays, where the inhabitants could either command a good view of the coastline or could see nearby villages placed on strategic headlands that served as lookout posts. Each settlement occupied a strategic position close to reliable sources of drinking water. As time went on, territorial boundaries seemed to have become more rigid and were often marked by cemeteries. For example, most cemeteries on nearby Santa Rosa Island are associated with major villages, both on the coast and in the interior, some of them perhaps serving as territorial markers. As populations increased and the islands became more crowded, so fighting escalated. The surge in violence came at a time when signs of dietary stress become more commonplace on the bones of the dead. The biological anthropologists Patricia Lambert and Philip Walker have chronicled numerous examples of forearm fractures sustained when parrying blows, nasal fractures, healed skull wounds, and injuries caused by spears or arrows. Many of the head injuries healed, having been inflicted by relatively slender, blunt instruments. Both the malnutrition and the increased violence took hold at a time of great climatic instability and marked social change. Santa Barbara Channel waters were generally cool and productive, but on land conditions were generally dry, with serious droughts well recorded in tree rings and deep-sea cores in about 950 and 1250. The droughts resulted in a consolidation of smaller settlements into larger ones and in the actual abandonment of areas with marginal water supplies around the islands as well as on the mainland. Violence and increased competition for food were insidious consequences of major drought cycles. On the islands, every settlement was matrilocal. That is, the women stayed in the villages of their birth while the men married into them. This had a strategic advantage, in that it fostered alliances between neighboring villages where blood-related males dwelled. At the time of the great droughts, we know from linguistic research concerning historic populations that islanders and mainlanders spoke different languages, as if there were two distinct groups. The institution of matrilocal residence may have developed in the face of repeated threats of attack from the mainland, where food supplies were short and territories crowded. As island populations increased, so the pressure on highly regarded foods like red abalone increased. These meaty shellfish flourish in shallow water and can reach a considerable size. Small groups of women would wade in tidal pools, diving in shallow water to pry abalone off the rocks. They would toss their catch into shallow baskets, swimming across the rocky bottom just below the low tide level, timing their visits for the lowest tides of the month. Back at camp, they would deftly pry open the abalone with bone levers, and then pound the delicate flesh before roasting it. By the time of the warm centuries, the abalone taken were much smaller, but the food shortfall was overcome by widening the diet to include many more fish species over and above the inshore kelp bed species favored in earlier times. Just like Great Basin foragers, the Chumash learned the advantages of a broad diet. By 1100, the fishers were venturing into deeper water aboard the sewn plank canoes known as tummals, taking deep-water species such as shark and tuna with hook and line. They were also using sophisticated toggle harpoons against sea mammals, a technology long in use in the far north. This intensified fishing was a deliberate effort to widen the diet during a harsh drought cycle. The Channel Islands have relatively few edible plants, and they lack the plentiful acorns so important on the mainland. For centuries, the islanders imported acorns by exchanging them for thousands of shell beads manufactured with fine drills made with the good quality chert found on Santa Cruz Island. At a few island sites, the remains of plants only native to the mainland provide clear evidence of this trade after 1200. Interestingly, the shell bead trade accelerated dramatically during the late first millennium, just at the time when droughts deepened and competition for plant foods intensified. At the same time, the people relied heavily on fish, moving into more permanent villages as they became tethered to local fishing grounds and beaches where they could land and maintain their canoes. Political and social circumstances on the islands were volatile during the drought centuries. As the population grew at a time of bountiful fisheries, so competition for the best fishing spots and the richest shell beds would have intensified. As we have seen, violence broke out. People were killed, territorial boundaries hardened and were defended more aggressively. Inevitably, too, some individuals or kin groups acquired control of specific fishing areas or desirable plant patches. Such power gave them enhanced authority, and, perhaps, a higher position in new social hierarchies that developed over the generations. Local society became more hierarchical, ruled by local chiefs who formed alliances with one another and sometimes presided over several villages. Some of them were also canoe captains, a specialty so valued that in later times they were members of a formal brotherhood. On the islands, people responded to drought by living in densely inhabited villages. Their leaders controlled a rapidly growing trade with the mainland that seems to have resulted in a sharp decrease in violence. People suffered from malnutrition on many occasions, but the suffering may have been less than that on the mainland, where drought in the interior decimated acorn crops and drastically reduced stands of wild plant foods. On the mainland, as on the islands, each community adopted the classic response to severe drought. They placed their settlements close to permanent water sources. Judging from the results of crowding in shanty towns on the edge of modern industrial cities, we can speculate that there were serious problems with water pollution and sanitation in now much more crowded settlements, with the inevitable epidemics of dysentery and other diseases that were less common in small villages. In the end, it seems that the island and mainland chiefs developed social mechanisms for dampening down the competition and violence that resulted from food shortages. Around 1300, we find complex alliances and other mechanisms for reducing strife coming into play, and these were closely connected with an explosion in island-mainland trade and in exchange with groups living far away in the interior, even as far away as the southwest. These mechanisms endured long after the great droughts of the warm centuries were forgotten. In a region where unpredictable rainfall and changing sea temperatures made everyone vulnerable to climate change, and where the experience of earlier generations provided precedent for people anchored to coastal fishing grounds or to acorn harvests. The Chumash maintained contacts not only with neighboring groups, but also with people far inland. Their trade networks extended as far as the southwest, where ancient Pueblo farmers responded to the same catastrophic droughts with different strategies. A hot, sultry afternoon has settled on the floor of Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. The air is heavy and still, weighing on the visitors passing through the empty rooms of Pueblo Bonito. A huge bank of black thunderclouds masses on the western horizon, mocking the bright sunlight shining on the canyon walls. The clouds pile ever higher. Distant lightning flickers through the menacing overcast. Thunder rumbles ominously. Violent wind gusts sweep through the canyon. A few heavy raindrops spatter the sandy path. The visitors run for shelter under a nearby overhang. A wall of gray approaches, but evaporates as the approaching storm changes course and drops its load downstream. Bright sunlight returns to bake the canyon floor once again. If you live in a semi-arid environment, you have to be prepared to roll with the climatic punches. The ancestral Pueblo of the Southwest were masters of flexible and opportunistic living in landscapes where movement meant survival. A modern-day Tewa Indian oral tradition from the Southwest proclaims, "Movement, clouds, wind, and rain are one. Movement must be emulated by the people." Great Basin bands survived through mobility. Coastal fishing groups moved into more densely populated villages. All of these people were hunters and wild plant gatherers, but others cultivated maize and beans and lived by farming the land. Farming was not a viable option in desert areas. California Indians with their acorn harvests had no incentive to grow crops. But in the Southwest, conservative farmers, who were experts at water management, thrived in often agriculturally marginal environments for over 3,000 years. Chaco Canyon lies in the heart of the San Juan Basin, a seemingly empty landscape that appears to stretch forever. Water in any form is short in the basin. Summer rainfall arrives as thunderstorms, gentler if sporadic winter rains in the form of snow between December and March. But the amount of rainfall is very small, invariably localized, and utterly unpredictable. Short-term climatic shifts, such as El Niños or prolonged droughts like those of the medieval warm period, could have a profound effect on agriculture on a year-by-year basis. Chaco Canyon is about 18.6 miles or 30 kilometers long and between a third and nearly a mile wide, or a half and 1.5 kilometers. After storms, the Chaco Wash flows strongly through the canyon, which is also watered by side streams and by natural seeps at the foot of the surrounding cliffs. But in times of drought, the canyon floor is bone dry. Hardly a promising location for any form of agriculture, one would think, but between the 9th and 12th centuries, at least 2,200 people dwelled within the canyon, and its population swelled considerably at times of major ceremonies. Numerous small hamlets of a few stone houses thrived at Chaco, also 9 large pueblos, commonly known as great houses. The permanent residents of Chaco farmed fertile patches of soil with the simplest of digging sticks and hoes. How many of them lived in the great houses rather than in hamlets we don't know, but places like Pueblo Bonito were capable of housing hundreds of people, provided the visitors brought their own food. The carrying capacity of the canyon itself was minuscule relative to the size of the great houses. On the south side of the canyon, the farmers relied on rainfall, while on the north they cultivated maize and beans in densely packed, gridded fields. By using canals about 4 feet or 1.2 meters wide, they channeled water stored in earthen dams through simple masonry gates from one gridded field to another. The farmers increased agricultural production dramatically as a result, but at a cost of increased vulnerability to severe drought, for their agricultural systems became less diversified. Fine-tuning water control systems on this small a scale would only work if there were enough rainfall to fill the canals and irrigate the field grids. In most years, there was not. The solution was diversification, with each household farming a variety of microenvironments, spreading the risk as one would when investing in mutual funds. But they never produced enough to feed everyone who visited the canyon. The expansion of Chaco's great houses between 1050 and 1100 depended in large part on a highly vulnerable agricultural system that worked fine in good rainfall cycles, but was disastrous when the rains failed. But despite this built-in vulnerability, the Chacoans built a series of great houses that were architecture on a grand scale, far larger than anything needed by a mere 2,200 people. Most of the Chaco pueblos were semicircular, often with several stories and numerous rooms associated with large and small kivas, subterranean chambers used for rituals of all kinds. The great houses are so unexpected and spectacular that some people call Chaco the Stonehenge of America. No one knows why such imposing great houses rose in this remote, arid canyon, but there is universal agreement that Chaco became a place of supreme ritual importance between the 9th and 12th centuries. People traveled here from far away, bringing grain, timber beams, turquoise for ornaments, and exotic commodities such as tropical bird feathers, presumably at times of major ceremonies, such as those that marked the passage of the solstices. The most imposing of the great houses, Pueblo Bonito, was begun in about AD 860 and enjoyed a complex architectural history that lasted until about 1115. By this time, Chaco exercised a profound cultural and spiritual influence over an enormous area of the San Juan Basin. A series of symbolic and irregular roads radiated from the canyon, but their function and symbolic significance eludes us. Experts have debated the significance of Chaco for generations. Perhaps the most powerful individuals in the canyon were religious leaders. They were guardians of the spiritual knowledge that governed a society where religion and agriculture went hand in hand. By combining agriculture and clever water management with complex ritual beliefs, the people flourished in times when rainfall was relatively abundant. Here, human existence depended not only on water management, but, they believed, on the meticulous performance of elaborate rituals and dances, on the skill of people who were guardians of sacred knowledge. This was why such stupendous great houses rose in an arid canyon where the setting was spectacular. People came from many miles away, drawn by the powerful spiritual associations of the place. Chaco had developed rapidly during a long period of relatively plentiful rainfall by San Juan standards. Tree rings tell us that the persistent and increasingly severe droughts that affected so much of the American West descended on the canyon after 1100, at a time when Chaco's need for timber and building labor was at its height. Agricultural productivity withered. Water supplies slowly evaporated. To the people who lived stoically through the drought, it must have seemed as if the forces of the supernatural had deserted them, that their leaders had lost their ability to communicate with the gods. Within a half-century, the great houses were deserted. The Chacoans had moved elsewhere. This pattern of movement was a familiar strategy in an area where rainfall ebbed and flowed, and no single community was completely self-sufficient. No one at Chaco, or elsewhere in the Southwest, had any illusions about crop failure and hunger. Every family maintained kin ties with communities elsewhere, traded with them, responded with food when need be. By the same token, people living in better watered areas knew that their kin would move to live among them if conditions for farming were better than at home. Chaco itself exercised an influence over a wide area, especially to the north and west, where people moved after 1100. Other pueblos rose to prominence, among them Aztec above the Animas River. Then, even farther north, great communities flourished in the Moctezuma Valley and in Mesa Verde, places where densely populated settlements lay close to more dependable water supplies. But once again, a severe drought from 1276 to 1299 caused people in these great pueblos to disperse to escape conflict, as more people crowded into great houses and food supplies grew increasingly scarce. High infant mortality rates and reduced birth rates owing to health problems may have caused local population densities to fall, but also the social and technological means to deal with the crisis were inadequate. So the people relied on their ancient strategy of movement, going to live in better watered areas to the east, south, and west, where there were already communities with friendly kin capable of supporting large numbers of people. For the Pueblo, movement was the only logical solution to the droughts of the warmer centuries. We know there was hunger and fighting for food and water. There is even evidence of ritual cannibalism. Fortunately, the ancient traditions kicked in, and people adjusted by moving away, household by household. In some pueblos, large numbers of clay pots and stone tools, also heavy grinding stones, still lie where their owners left them. The strategy of movement was successful. Centuries later, the legacy of the ancestral Pueblo thrives in vibrant oral traditions and ritual observances, in architectural and agricultural practices that resonate in the Southwest to this day. Despite all the trauma of the Spanish Entrada and the upheavals wrought by industrial society, Pueblo communities are politically autonomous today, using ancient shared rituals to promote common identity and harmony. Chaco Canyon and other pueblos remain part of the ancestral memory of modern Pueblo societies, and visitors still go to breathe in the strength of the ancient places and their inhabitants. There was no mass migration out of the Chaco, no one moment when the elders abandoned the great houses that were the focus of life in the canyon. The close deliberations took place in subterranean kivas around winter fires, also at home between husbands and wives as their hungry children slept. Perhaps several husbands would trek out from the canyon to visit relatives, to prepare the way for a move to somewhere where they would be welcome and there would be enough food to tide them over until next cycle of planting and harvest. Then 2 or 3 families would pack up their possessions, abandoning the small homestead where their ancestors had dwelled before them. They left with regret, perhaps, but comfortable with their decision, as they knew that the ancestors would have approved of it. The great droughts of the American West had their origins in complex and still little understood interactions between ocean and atmosphere in the Pacific. These same interactions, reflected in the cool cycle of the Pacific decadal oscillation and in the continual, unpredictable swings of El Niños and La Niñas, also brought havoc and food shortages to elaborate civilizations in Central America and the Andes.